All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining, and thank you for hopefully, trying to stay awake in that late afternoon of a long day of programming. It's really great to be here today. I'm here to talk, as Christopher mentioned, about world building and AI. So my background involves working in world building. I was a creative lead at Alex McDowell's studio. He was the production designer for Minority Report, among many other films. Did a lot of work with him around immersive, around urban design, thinking about how worlds and narratives intersect. Did a bunch of work for the Dubai World Expo with world building as well. Led work for brands as they were thinking about how their worlds exist. And currently, I work with Todd Trazas, who's somewhere here, with a matching Santa hat to my outfit, and thinking about how do AI tools support the process of storytelling and creation. So I'm here to try to talk about how all of these worlds intersect to me. And kind of the linchpin of all of this is my background in computational neuroscience and spatial economics, thinking about the data behind how we understand the self and how we understand space and how those things enable us to create kind of the future of storytelling experiences. So a little bit of background on what we do at Fabric. We run an innovation studio that helps brands and studios adapt to emerging technologies. We also run a living lab accelerator that helps bring startups and creators together to experiment with new technologies. And we do all this with kind of a workflow-based approach. We're trying to think about how does technology work together in an additive way to help us with producing and making things happen. So this is our kind of map of the landscape right now. But this is very nitty-gritty. I'm going to pull up a little bit, and for this talk, we're going to be at a higher level view. We're going to talk about a lot of this, which is how the content landscape in general is changing. So this means film and TV, but also across other mediums as well. So one of the big things that's changing that we're going to talk a lot about is franchises can now be supported by shared production infrastructure across formats. So when we talk about worlds and we think about world building, the Star Wars, the Lord of the Rings, the Harry Potters, all of these franchises, the world was a shared narrative construct, but now we're moving towards this idea that maybe it can be a shared production construct as well, which enables us to think more about the future of interactive and immersive and transmedia storytelling and where all of that's going. Not going to touch on that too much because we're going to get into it more in the rest of the presentation. Another kind of big trend that's happening in the content landscape is that the traditional Hollywood supply chain has needed to become more efficient. Costs are kind of ballooning, but as we look against where revenue is coming in, we need to kind of match those with more efficient pipelines, hopefully with the goal of having more films, more kind of bites of the apple, and more kind of ways to potentially get back revenue. At the same time, there's a very hyper efficient method of production that's happening, but on the user side, with creators that are using social platforms to kind of collapse production, distribution, and monetization. So if you look at platforms like TikTok, there are creators self-funding often and creating their own content, putting it out there, but then being able to monetize through their merchandise, through advertising, through brand deals. And that has its own kind of world that's developing. In the bottom here are some trends that are happening kind of in the broader context outside of some of these spaces, where one is that they're changing formats and distribution that are redefining the value of what people pay for. If we're thinking film and TV, it was we're watching something on TV and we're paying through the our eyeballs contributing to the advertising dollars, right? Or I'm even simpler, I'm going and I'm buying a ticket to go watch a movie, which is a very specific purchase, and that we can match that against the cost of production and the cost of marketing for a specific piece of IP. But when we think about where we're at now with streaming economics, that's the value, the additive value of content to a platform is changing. That's a new way of valuing content. And if we look to Web3, or if we look to what's kind of happening in the interactive and immersive space, the thing that the user, the thing that the consumer is paying for looks a little bit different. They're paying sometimes for the avatar that lets them be a part of the experience, that lets them customize who they want to be with relation to a story. And that's the piece that they want to pay for rather than the experience itself. And we'll talk a little bit more about that piece as well. And then quickly, brands are being part of the content story as well. Obviously, Barbie was a big hit last year, but I think beyond that, if you look at the story of how Nike is on Fortnite with Airphoria, or these other brands are telling stories, there's a relationship between the content that they're creating and the marketing, and then the product that they're releasing. And consumers are kind of part of that whole cycle. And that is its own way of storytelling that's kind of continuing to grow. And then finally, when we talk about spatial computing, it's often a functional thing that we talk about, right? Of like, I want to get from point A to point B. How is technology making that more efficient? But there's a narrative layer to that as well, right? Historically, we have Niantic with augmented reality, but Google Earth has slowly been rolling out a beta for augmented reality filters as well. And so a maps experience that used to be functional now can also start to be a narrative playground and a narrative landscape. So all of these things are changing, and the question is, like, what does that mean in relation to world building? When I talk about world building, I talk about it in 3 different ways. I talk about it as a narrative construct, a business construct, and a production construct. And I think historically world building kind of sits a lot of times in the narrative construct of thinking about it. I was in New Zealand last couple of weeks, and that was where Lord of the Rings was filmed. I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan. But when we think about world building, we think about things like Lord of the Rings, right? Where there's this beautifully built, deep lore to a world. The world has a systems logic. Lord of the Rings has, this deep language behind it, and, potentially also some spatial design as well, into thinking about how does this world play out across space and across time. And that's, there's a lot of depth to that, and there's a lot of beauty to that aspect of world building. And the exciting thing now is we live in a context where that narrative construct gets to live across these formats. So we have all these devices, we have all these platforms, we have all these formats, and all of these formats have different ways then that they situate the viewer or the audience or the user relative to the story. So if we're moving from kind of the traditional thinking about storytelling with film and TV, the viewing experience, the audience experience is very passive. You're watching the story happen, and you're watching characters interact with each other in the context of a world. And the world was the production design, right? The world was the background to the story. But now with these formats that are emerging, you have the chance to potentially be a character in the world or to be situated relative to what's happening within the world. So that means that the way that we think about what it means to participate, the way that we think about demographics is evolving as well, right? From thinking about demographics as viewer-based data of like, are you male, are you female, are you above 25 or under 25? Now the types of data that you can look at are much more behavior specific. So I did a franchise study about 10 years ago and have done more since then, helping some of these franchises think through how do people want to participate in their brand? How do people want to participate in the story world? Some people want to participate for the lore. Some people want to participate for the social interaction. And some people want to participate, to show that they're a fan, right? And all of those different ways of identity are different ways of participation that actually tell more about how people want to engage, and are also more useful to know how to then monetize towards them, right? Because the demographic information doesn't necessarily tell you how people want to participate. So if we think that stories exist within story worlds made up of systems and relationships, when you build a dense enough and a robust enough world, then you have the narrative kind of meat to support storytelling across different formats. So when you have a rich world, you can say, hey, I want to follow this corner of the world and follow these characters, and can have experiences across these different formats. Which leads us to kind of the piece about world building as a business construct. So if I'm telling these stories across these formats, and I understand that each medium has its own way of storytelling and different ways that people want to participate with relation to it, then this is its own way of thinking about the monetization cycle. Now instead of me having a singular piece of IP in a singular format that someone can participate with and may or may not be the type of way they want to participate in the world, now I have different entry points. I'm seeing, my users, my audience as unique individuals who have their own ways that they want to engage, and so they each have their own entry point, right? Someone wants to participate more in an interactive way and to feel like they're a part of the story world, so they enter the story world through maybe the VR experience. Or someone wants to, check out a new podcast, and that's how they stumble into the narrative of the world. But the more formats that exist, the more ways that you have to enter and participate within this experience. And that's also related to what we were talking before about brands, right? So as brands, like this is Nike and Airforia, as they create this content, they're creating more entry points into the brand. So the brand historically is shoes, but now they're saying, hey, you're in Fortnite, you can get a skin, that's your own way of participating in the brand, and then maybe it's an entry point at some point to being a consumer of the product as well. The other piece that this enables is consumer co-creation. So in a context where there's user-generated content, where there's this landscape of people making content across social platforms, now participants don't just get to enter where they want, they get to contribute to the story in ways that they want, whether that's creating things that feel like they exist within the world of the story, like fanon, which is fan canon, through fan fiction, through fan art, and things like that, or through just engaging and having a conversation, like some of the things that happened around the premiere of Wicked recently, or the social movement to try to make Glicked happen. I don't know if anyone followed that, but that was trying to create their own a version of Barbenheimer with Gladiator 2 and Wicked. I missed it. I think I'm missing a slide here, but all of this is also linked to this idea of persistence of experience. So imagine that we have behind this image these different formats existing. If we think about the fact and we kind of pull out the journey of people as they move through these worlds, the hope is that as you're moving through these worlds, as you're moving through the VR experience, and then the TikTok, and then the theme park, and the TV show, that these worlds feel narratively consistent, that they feel experientially consistent, and that whatever you've learned about the world, whatever you learned about yourself in relation to the world, stays constant. And with it staying constant, the hope is also maybe at some point it can also start layering over my day-to-day experience. And so, Harry Potter as something that you can participate in the theme park, you can participate in, reading the books, you can participate in watching the movies, but through Niantic's Harry Potter game, you can also have it, in your day-to-day if you're walking around and then you're living in the wizarding world. And more recently with AI, there's also the idea of maybe I can chat to the characters, right? Maybe I can have them be, instead of calling my friend, I can call up one of the characters and have a conversation with them. So that piece kind of leads us to start thinking about how do these things start intersecting with world building as a production construct? How do we start thinking about these decisions that are narrative, that are business-based, then applying to or kind of following through to how we make production decisions? So one of the big things that has enabled this to happen and this progression to happen is moving from story worlds as being this system of relationships and logic to being, let's bring it to life as a volumetric world, right? Game engines, which is how we historically were bringing games to life, now become a way to hold the container of the world and the story in some way. And the idea being that now if you have this volumetric world, potentially you can create something cross-format. I think that this was touched on even in the last panel of you have these assets, you have these resources that are depicting and enabling you to see the story of the world. How does that maybe become the virtual scene that is playing on the LED screen as you're filming? Or is it a digital twin of your set that you use for pre-production? Or is it, you have to deprecate the assets and you have to change the quality of the assets, but you maybe use it then for a VR experience? Or you use kind of the character information to create avatars that people can use to engage with the story world and feel like they're interacting with the characters, right? The world as a production construct enables you to start thinking about how those assets are shared across these different universes. So when you think about world building and how it relates to where the content landscape is changing, one is on the narrative side, it's creating depth of narrative for exploration and giving a role potentially for users in relation to the world. And it's expanding opportunities on the business side for monetization because you're thinking in a user-centric way of how do they want to engage with the story world. And on the production side, it has the ability to potentially streamline costs for creation and enable complexity of interaction. So let me do a quick time check. Okay, great. So second half of this talk, we're going to dive into what that means a little bit more. If we think about all those, that content landscape that we went over, right? All of those changes that are happening. AI and data in different ways are fundamental to how each of those things are changing, right? the worlds for production across formats involves data at every part of it. Understanding consumers in the way that they want to engage and the way that they want to monetize things is so data heavy, right? You have to be able to understand consumer behavior and to be able to map that across different formats and different things. So that brings us to where the intersection of world building and AI exist. And there are a couple different categories we're going to touch on, and some of these you may know, some of these are just to kind of give kind of the landscape of where these things begin to intersect. So the first one is something we've touched on, which is the intersection of AI and volumetric worlds. We talked about how game engines and building these really complex representations of worlds is kind of core to potentially enabling cross-format production. But there's more AI kind of being added nowadays to build out these worlds and to add both more intuition to creating within these worlds, but also to actually building these out. So, for example, a lot of stuff happening in the animation space around not just enabling movement, but enabling physics and kind of these things to be built into how you interact with animation within the context of these worlds. There's a lot that's happening around retargeting, and obviously this is all talking about AI, not just in terms of generative AI, but around machine learning and around kind of what AI is enabling in a deeper way across production. And a lot of stuff around kind of kinematics and physics and motion. There's also stuff that has been happening for a long time around building out these worlds with more procedural logic for developing assets, right? And when we think about, again, how AI exists, and I'll touch on this a little bit more later as well, there's AI, as a big bubble, and within that is machine learning. Within machine learning is deep learning, and within that is generative AI. So when we talk about generative AI, it's a very specific type of AI that has more bottom-up, self-trained logic. Something like procedural systems are using more of a top-down symbolic logic of, in this case, this was a paper done around generating variations of houses, understanding the relationship of rooms to each other and using that to create variations of houses, but that fell within this logic, right? So that's the procedural kind of system for generation. There's also there's interesting things happening in that space. On the right is a company called Sloyd that does natural language-based procedural generation of objects. So it uses kind of shape primitives and interprets your text queue to create an asset that's meant to be designed and modified more procedurally or parametrically. And then to the left is this really fun little world building game called Tiny Glade that's all designed in terms of procedural ways of kind of building your houses and gates and all of that, and definitely worth checking out. So that's on the procedural side, but if we go kind of to the inverse side around generative, there's also things happening there around generating assets and using text-based prompts to generate assets. On this end, the assets that are generated we're still getting to good and workable, usable assets on the generative asset side for 3D assets, and part of that is because understanding the back side of an object or the other side of an object is difficult to do. And to the right is actually how neuroscientists think about maybe our brain understands understands 3D objects. We don't fully even understand or know how our brain interprets it. So similarly, AI models are going to take their time to understand 3D in a robust way. But the assets that you get out of a generative process for creating these assets is usually pretty messy, so you need to clean them up if you want to make them usable. You have to do a lot of work with your meshes and making this usable, because it's usually kind of high poly and not useful to what you want to make. So in this front, there are some great tools out there. ModTech Labs is doing some great stuff around cleaning up assets. ModTech Labs is in the room right now. Tim Porter is here. And thinking about how do we take this generative assets creation and bring them into actual pipelines. But all this comes back to that question of okay, we're building these worlds for production, but this is all building the 3D assets of the world, right? This is making the world a spatial construct. But what does it mean for this to be more of an interactable construct, right? What does it mean to have agents you can interact with, and characters in the world that are robust, that you can talk to, that give you depth of world to explore, right? Especially if we're trying to move beyond worlds for film and TV as digital twins and as kind of your what you're using during virtual production, you need interactivity within the world. So that's where we come to AI and responsive worlds. So when we think about where narratives are evolving, and we touched on this a little bit, historically we've had linear narratives. With gaming, we have non-linear narratives. We're moving now towards an era of emergent narrative, which is I'm an individual, I'm interacting with the world, and the world is responding in a unique way to how I'm interacting. Meaning that, you know, historically when we think about interaction with technology and interaction in general, there's a very specific input, right? I'm pressing something on my phone, I'm moving something on my joystick to enable a specific mechanic to happen in an interaction. When we move towards a more computational construct where we have more data to work with within responsive worlds, anything can be a trigger. There's more, there are more implicit kind of forms of control and more implicit forms of interaction, like your orientation, your eye gaze, your affect is measured through, you know, your pulse or whatever else. Those can all be their own triggers within these worlds. But for the world to respond in that way, there has to be enough data and systems behind it to enable that. And similarly, it's not just within the context of a singular experience. We talked before about this idea of like, I want to participate in these worlds that are cross experiences. If that's the case, we need a continuity of experience, right? Of as I'm moving from medium to medium and format to format, give me a second. This consistency of what do I know about the world? What is my relationship to the characters? If I'm in a theme park and I'm talking to a character, and then I go and talk to the AI version of the character at home, how do I feel like those are the same characters that I'm talking to, right? And to enable that, we need AI systems behind that to understand and collate data about the individual, and then understand and collate data points about the world across these formats and what is possible. So some of that is this agent-based understanding and agents that are able to respond and have knowledge to them. And the picture on there is from a really interesting paper, and I can share a link with that, around agent-based interaction. But some of that, but those generative systems for agents kind of creating interactions and enabling kind of interactions within the context of the world, then have to meet a top-down architecture around character progression, around narrative progression, and around world evolution, so that, you know, your local interactions that are supported with AI, right? You go up to a virtual character and you're able to have this really long and in-depth conversation is really fun in its own space, but then you want to match that local interaction with a top-down logic so that that interaction then fits within a broader narrative, so then you're maybe sent on a quest and you feel like you're moving towards something more additive. To enable that to happen, we need to understand data about the individual, right? We need to understand, when we think about data about the individual, it involves data about presence, data about perspective, what are they taking in of the environment or the medium, and performance, how are they acting in the context of whichever format they're engaging with. And between all of those things, there's so much more, right? There's a complexity of, there's emotions and thoughts and decision making that go into this. And within that data, there's also progression and temporal phases and all of this that we need to account for. And that's just on the user side. On the world side, we have to understand, you know, all the data that exists in a world, if it's you know, a virtual world that we're creating for them to interact with, or if it's the world of the story that exists across all these different formats. We need to know the data about the world and data about how the world is evolving, right? The story world, what are the temporal rhythms of the world? Is the world itself evolving and not a static thing? And how are all these things kind of co-evolving with relation to each other? Another category of how world building and AI are intersecting, and I'll touch on this quickly because I think there are a lot of talks that are doing a much deeper dive into this, is AI and real world capture. So a lot of the research and work that is done around nerfs, around Gaussian splats, around taking data even in like a sports context and being able to accurately represent what's happening in the world. LiDAR used in autonomous vehicle context. All of these are different ways of trying to attempt to capture the real world in some way and use that to make decision making around experience design. And also shout out to Global Objects, since we're here today, who's doing some of that great work. So one of the last ones is generative AI and world building. And I think the reason it's important to touch on this is because this is a space that still needs a lot of work. So when you think about historically AI and how it's existed, I talked a little bit about how AI is, this big container, and there's bottom-up kind of self-trained AI, and there's top-down AI, right? That's symbolic AI, which is kind of historically, if we look into the 1950s, the 1960s, that's the version of AI that existed. There's a lot of human input into creating a knowledge base. There's some inference on top of that, and inference was, the intelligent piece of trying to come up with take the knowledge base and take it a little bit further. And the idea was you could use it to kind of get these answers. The challenge with that is scale, right? To be able to, everything needing to come back to a knowledge base. Is it? Okay. Everything needing to come to a knowledge base means that you are limited in how much and how intelligent the AI that you're creating can be. So in the 80s and 90s, we moved towards deep learning via neural networks of how do I throw all this data in, let it self-organize through finding similarities, and train itself to find patterns. And if it's not done well, or if you don't have enough data, you run into the puppy versus bagel, and this is almost probably 10 years old at this point, of, if these images are so close to each other, how can I tell them apart? And obviously, if we're humans, we can look at it close enough and start to find the differences, but if you're an AI without enough data, they do look really similar to each other. But thankfully, or for better or for worse, as neural networks developed, it also was around the time that the internet was being developed, which is a whole repository of content, of data to train these systems. And for better or for worse, with all the scraping of internet data, we've kind of arrived at where we are in the AI story with these models that are based around prediction, right? Based on probability of what the next token is. Mary had a little blank is going to be probably Mary had a little lamb, right? Because that's the probability based on everything, all the versions of that children's rhyme that has existed within the corpus of our knowledge. And so these systems are generally based on kind of predicting what the next token is. Similarly for visual systems, where with diffusion models, these source images are taken, basically like deaggregated, and then decontextualized to kind of have, in terms of their relationship to other tokens or other pixels, and then used to generate images in terms of probability, right? Of like which things will exist next to each other. The challenge with these models is when we start to think about training and 3D context. So for example, everyone knows this image, right? Muybridge, you can say it's like the first film in some way of like stringing these frames together to create a film. That's based on capturing a real horse, right? But it's collapsed into 2D information. In the real world, a horse is a 3D thing with different sides and different information to it. But what we use to train these AI systems is not the real world information about the horse, it's the footage of horses over time. For the most part, there's more 3D information being used in training data nowadays, but a lot of the footage, a lot of what's being used to train these visual models has been this 2D footage. So if you have 2D footage that doesn't fully, represent 3D information used to train these models, that's where it kind of falls apart, and we struggle with some of the things around spatial and temporal consistency that you see in generative image models. So Sora released, has anyone played with it so far this week after release? I see a couple hands. But this is from Sora's paper that they released a while back of they're trying to get at that. They're trying to bring more world understanding into how they train these models with patches so that there's more spatial information across time to better understand how objects move and how 3D space operates. So that's one method. Google's also working on some stuff. In the last week, Google released Google Genie 2, which is creating more foundational world models that are able to kind of generate potentially playable worlds that have some understanding of physics and interaction built into them. But this is a space that needs to develop further, both for these worlds to have more 3D information and world information to be trained to have an understanding of how 3D worlds and context actually work, and to bring more control and consistency. And so the question is like, is this going to evolve fast enough, or how do these systems for generation meet with needs for control? So there are tools like one of the tools we work with called Playbook 3D that are exploring how do you have the interaction of 3D environments and generative to kind of have more control and bring that into the creative process. Finally, very quickly, because I think I'm almost at time, the kind of last intersection of world building and AI is in this, AI and the real world, right? We kind of already started touching on it with the last piece. The camera is a technology of data capture, and the technology of capture changes information in some way. So like we saw with Muybridge, it's 3D information of a horse translated and capturing some aspect of that with the camera, but not all of it. So when we're creating these versions of the world, the data is an incomplete representation of the physical world. So as we think about, how AI is going to evolve, and world building potentially at the core of that, and how we think about how it continues to grow, these are currently the forms, the predominant kind of formats that AI is trained on, right? Text, audio, video, and now increasingly some elements of 3D. Our intelligence arises from us being embodied, individuals that interact with the world, and we have more than these senses, right, in how we interact. Neuroscientists will say we have upwards of 30 senses in how we interact with the world, and most of that information isn't computable and isn't data. So as we think about, our stories and how we kind of interface with these tools, there's always going to be a difference between how AI represents the world and how, we experience the world. And so, while I obviously, run an AI company, so I'm excited about where the tools are going, but I think the tools are going to be our assistive devices for us doing, able to experience the world and share a version of it in its own way. But for us, it's going to be how do we use them to extend what we can do and have them as a force multiplier rather than something that necessarily, detracts from what we can do. So that's my provocation to kind of end today. Thank you all for being here today. And feel free to chat or to learn more about us here.
Thank you, Rachel. We're at time, but if somebody's got one quick question, would you be willing to take a quick question? Anyone? One quick question. Okay.
Hello, it is Ben Broad, your friend. Great to see you. So, as a lot of folks in this space are looking at AI, and especially based on what you were explaining about, like what AI can do, what should people think about today using AI, planning for the future, knowing what it can and can't do? I know that's big and broad, but
yeah, I think one is to experiment with the tools, know the capacity of what it can do and what it can't do. I think sometimes people are scared of a technology, and I think the more that you know the technology, the more you can advocate for where you want it to be or not be utilized. So I think that's one thing. And then I think I'm biased, but read a little bit of neuroscience, try to understand, how the brain works and how we can use these as assistive tools, and also try to understand, maybe a little bit of the technology to know how it might evolve.
Thank you, Rachel. If anybody's got additional questions, I'm sure she'll make herself available after we're done talking. We're heading into the last panel of the day.